how effective do you think blocking the foreign accounts of the major plutocrats is going to be in terms of turning them against Putin?
It's a very important question. I think it's going to be quite effective. So when US introduced so-called Magnitsky Act in November, December 2012, that was a major blow to the regime. And it's not surprising that the regime reacted very rationally and very quickly with something completely counterproductive. So government introduced an act which prohibited Americans adopting Russian kids, Russian orphans. And in Russia, foreigners can only adopt kids that Russians don't want to adopt. And in most cases, Americans would adopt sick kids who could be nurtured to health only in a rich country. And so we actually have Russian kids dying because of that reaction. And that reaction was angry and knee-jerk exactly because Mr. Putin was very unhappy. If you actually look at Russian foreign policy doctrine, which is one of the decrees Mr. Putin signed on May 7, 2012, the day when he once again became a president, one of the items in the foreign policy doctrines says, we don't want things like that to happen. We don't want unilateral violations of economic and travel freedoms of Russian citizens. This is one of the major foreign policy goals of Russian foreign service. And in that sense, it will be a major blow. Now, in the last couple of years, Mr. Putin actually has forced and encouraged many of his friends to remove assets from abroad to Russia, to repatriate assets. But we know that many of them have not done that, and we know they will be quite unhappy about that. But will they actually oppose Mr. Putin? That I don't think. But they will be very unhappy.
News reports today say that Russia is preparing for the worst case in trade sanctions, that we're already starting to see European and U.S. banks cutting bank lines to Russian companies, and they're setting up state guarantees for bank lines. My contacts in Russia appear to be cultivating Asian sources, looking to what's going on there, do you think?
I think this is what Russia is thinking about. So if you actually try to produce the pecking order of sanctions, the less painful ones are removing Russia from G8 or OECD, not coming to G8 summit, turning it into G1 summit. This is something that Mr. Putin is unhappy about, but he doesn't care. Then the visa bans and asset freezes of important members of the government. This is much more painful. Then what you just said, banks, disconnecting Russia from international banking system. This is very painful. But indeed, there are Asian banks, and I'm sure Russia will move to the Asian banks and will try to do business with Asian banks. And then the nuclear option is, well, unfortunately, it's no longer a joke, right? But we are talking about nuclear countries, talking about military actions. But the nuclear option is an oil embargo, gas embargo, something like was imposed on Iran. Now, this is very hard for Europeans to do because Germany depends on Russian gas. And this is, I think, Russia considers, but is not too scared about. But if that happens, I think unless China or some other countries join this embargo, which is probably unlikely, Russia will still be able to sell through other channels. And that will be costly. Infrastructure is not there, but it is possible. So I think it's not Iran-like sanctions. It is impossible exactly because Asia will not join those. In many European countries, the top companies have tens of % of their business dependent on cooperation with Russian counterparts. So in that sense, that will be very unpopular in Europe.
In the discussions with Putin today, how that affects both the economy and the geopolitical calculus. Heavy dependence on oil and gas, both for the economy, but as a lever in trying to assert their role and their power, particularly in Eastern Europe today, but really around the world. There's been a suggestion here that with the enormous access that we now have, the United States now has to unconventional oil and gas, that one of the things that we could do longer term is to free up our ability to export natural gas, particularly into Europe, Eastern Europe, where the Ukraine is essentially 100% dependent on Russia for natural gas today. It's going to take some time for us to do that because we've really got to convert import facilities to export facilities, so it isn't going to happen over time. But my question is, will that be a significant deterrent to Putin, either for pure economic reasons or for geopolitical leverage reasons, if we were to make it clear that we are going to move aggressively in that direction?
If oil prices and gas prices go down, Russia will really run out of money. I was talking about stagnation, so economic slowdown, stagnation. This is happening when oil price is at 100. If oil price goes down by $20 per barrel or by $40 per barrel, Russia has some reserves to buffer the shock, but it cannot sustain that without really cutting incomes of people who like Mr. Putin. And they will stop liking him once their pensions, once their salaries will go down. And in that sense, exporting natural gas to Europe, where it's so expensive, investing in shale gas in Ukraine, for example, these things will change the equation really by a great margin. And one of the things which Mr. Putin is worried about that a lot. So one of the things which happened once we were on a panel with him, and the moderator remembered, it was 2010, and so he was looking back on his years in power and pontificating, and he's delivered a lot to the Russian population. But one of the things he said, we've not diversified the economy, and that's actually a problem. He understands all of those issues. And then I was asking in private people, does he have plan B if oil prices go down and gas prices go down? And the answer was economic advisors have talked to me about this for so many times, and they've been wrong. Whenever I needed oil price to go up, it always went up. And he's right. We academics, we should recognize that all the data points, all the observations are consistent with his theory that somehow he will get through that. It will probably take one more observation which contradicts that theory to change everything. But so far, I think he believes that somehow he will get through it. And but yet the numbers tell us that maybe when he runs out of money, something will have to change. So the basic answer is oil and gas doesn't depend on the quality of the governance, of the political institutions, of the judiciary system, of the financial system, as much as all these things you were talking about. Human capital intensive industries. They need the very sophisticated financial system. They need protection of property rights from government, from corrupt government officials, and from politically connected large companies. And this is something which doesn't exist in Russia, and that's why it's not surprising that oil sector and gas sector is doing so much better than software engineers who choose to build their companies somewhere here. So one of the champions of diversification is Yandex, the very successful Russian search company, which when it listed in NASDAQ in 2011 said we have a risk that government will become will start tightening the political, start removing political freedoms, and that will hurt our business because they produce news, they use online payments, which are very important for crowdfunding civil activists and political movements, and they warned investors that that may hurt our business. And they were right. Yesterday, Nasdaq stock price for Yandex went down 10%. In that sense, it's not surprising. Once, in 2001, I actually asked Mr. Putin, how do you see Russia in 2010? Okay? And that was a World Economic Forum meeting, so many important people were there, and he said, we will be happy. Okay? And at that point, it was not clear what he meant by happy. I didn't understand what exactly he meant. He didn't have time to elaborate on that. But now I think the main question was about we, whom he meant when he said we will be happy. And we see that the system that is built in Russia is good for some industries and not others. It's not surprising that in some industries you can actually prosper, and these industries include oil and gas and metals and so on. And yet another question is more recent. You mentioned Mr. Medvedev. One of his important projects was Skolkovo Institute of Technology. This is a partnership with Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And just today I was exchanging emails with my former colleague who is a vice president of Skolkovo, who was Condi student here, Alexei Sitnikov. He says hi, but he says that the current crisis doesn't help developing an institution like this. I can go on and on like that, but it's certainly the anti-Western hysteria, isolation, doesn't help innovation, diversification, international investment. And I would just want to quote a report which was published last week, actually this week, about the New Economic School. I was running New Economic School for 9 years. I'm very happy and proud of what my colleagues and myself did. And this report said, New Economic School, that was promoted by Russian media. The report said, we experts, unknown experts, we estimate the contribution of New Economic School to Russian economy and politics as a hostile, medium-intensity military intervention. Because New Economic School trains mainstream economists, and this is really bad for Russian development. So with these things, when you think that you need to invest in knowledge, education, and so on and so forth, this political stance is not really helpful. But even without recent crisis, which generated all this propaganda and brainwashing, even without recent crisis, you have fundamental interest of the ruling elite not to develop things which reduce bribe-taking and expropriation.
Yes. Other questions? Yes, right here. Let's see, we need a microphone down here, please. Yeah, we want to make sure that you can be heard. Just 1 second, she's right there.
You've talked about the possible embargo of oil and gas, and that's the only sort of product you've talked about. But clearly, if that trade stopped, they still have the assets in the ground, and when the sun comes out again, with the passage of time, they get back into the game. But are there other diversified products, goods and services that Russia could be selling in a integrated international economy that they're missing out on in this period of time if we, wind up being at odds?
You're asking a question about the general structure or potential structure of Russian economy, or about sanctions?
Are there other products that they can sell into the international economy that would encourage international trade that would stop in the event of this? Or is it just the oil and gas?
No, so currently, if you add up oil, gas, and metals, and fertilizers and other natural resources and commodities, you would end up with 90% of Russian exports. The oil and gas taxes account for half of Russian budget, 10% of GDP. So Russia is not Saudi Arabia. Russia is actually quite diversified as a domestic economy. But in terms of its participation in the global economy, it is actually very, very much natural resource dependent. And what will happen, though, with capital outflow going up, ruble weakening, maybe some other industries will become more competitive. But at the moment, Russia's comparative advantage is oil and gas.